In this video, we're going to look at the cardiac cycle. This is chapter 20, part 8. So one cardiac cycle includes all of the events associated with one heartbeat. So the cardiac cycle is going to consist of systole and diastole of the atria, plus the systole and diastole of the ventricles. So in each cardiac cycle, the atria and the ventricles are going to alternately contract and relax, and this forces blood from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. Now, as a chamber of the heart contracts, the blood pressure within that particular chamber is going to increase. In this video, we are going to look at all of these particular events or changes within a cardiac cycle. So we're going to look at the electrical events, the pressure changes in the heart, heart sounds, volume changes, and mechanical events. So first, just specifically looking at the electrical events, we have a typical ECG or EKG here. So first off, we have the atrial systole. Now during atrial systole, this is when the atria are contracting, and at the same time, this is when the ventricles are relaxed. At number 1 here, this is where we have depolarization of the sinoatrial node, which causes atrial depolarization. And remember, this is marked by the P wave in an ECG. Then we have the QRS complex here. QRS complex is going to mark the onset of ventricular depolarization. And kind of right at the end here, this is when we are going to start ventricular systole, which is, remember, the contraction of the ventricles. So we have the QRS complex, or depolarization of the ventricles, that occurs directly prior to ventricular systole. And then we have the T wave here, which marks the onset of ventricular repolarization. So here we have a diagram that indicates the pressure changes in the heart. This is during a typical heartbeat. So here at the top here we have those same markings that we saw in the past diagram, looking at atrial systole, ventricular systole, and then that relaxation period. And those are going to correspond here if we just kind of draw a line down here. So we're going to have kind of the same time frame here for these pressure changes. So first, right here at this beginning of the atrial systole, at the beginning of this little pink area, we have atrial depolarization causes atrial systole. Now during this section, as the atria contract, it's going to exert pressure on the blood that's in the atria, and that's going to force blood through the open atrioventricular valves and going to push blood into the ventricles. Oh, before we go forward too, I want to quickly go over the different colors of these lines here. So we have the red line is the aortic pressure. The blue line, you can kind of see this line all the way over here, is going to be the left ventricular pressure. And then the green line, which stays kind of near the bottom here, is the left atrial pressure. So we're going to see the pressure in the atria, the ventricle, and the aorta. So after we have the atria contract, this is when we're going to have ventricular depolarization causing ventricular systole. So as we have this kind of purple section, this is when ventricular systole begins. We have pressure rising inside the ventricles. So we can really see this ventricular pressure here. This blue line really rises quite rapidly here. And this is going to push blood up against the atrioventricular valves and it forces them shut. So we have the bicuspid valve closes. It occurs right here as we initiate that pressure buildup in the ventricles. So it's going to push that valve shut between the atria and the ventricles so that we don't get any backflow of blood. So right at this time, this is when all 4 valves are closed. So ventricular volume is going to stay the same, and we're going to kind of see that in the next picture, or in the next couple pictures, where we're going to look at volume changes. So when we kind of build up, so we're going to start, I'll erase that, we're going to start down here. This is when the bicuspid valve closes and we build up pressure in the ventricles. And then here at this point, when we have quite a bit of pressure in the ventricle, this is when the aortic valve opens. Now, continuation of the contraction of the ventricles is going to cause pressure inside the chambers to rise quite rapidly. We're going to open that aortic valve, and then the blood is going to flow from the ventricles into the aorta. And so when this aortic valve opens right here, we really see also that pressure in the aorta, that red line is really going to increase as well, because all that blood is going to be moving from the ventricles into the aorta. So then, as all the blood is going to be leaving the ventricle and going into the aorta, into the rest of the body, the pressure in the ventricle is going to drop until all the blood is out, and that's, well, we're going to have actually the aortic valve is going to close there, and then here is where we have that bicuspid valve open again, and we're going to start filling that ventricle up with blood from the atria again. But this is going to be when the ventricles are relaxing, and so they're kind of they're very relaxed, allowing the blood to come in. So here are the times in the cardiac cycle when you're going to hear heart sounds. So this is like when a doctor is going to be listening to your chest with a stethoscope, listening for those heart sounds. So these are the particular places we're going to hear heart sounds. Now, the sound of a heartbeat comes from the blood turbulence that's caused by closing of heart valves. So closing valves is really what causes pretty much the sounds of heart beating. Because smooth flowing blood with no turbulence is completely silent. We only hear sounds in blood or in any other fluid when there's going to be turbulence. And so that closing of valves causes quite a bit of turbulence, and that's where we're going to get those sounds from. This first sound here, labeled S1, it's going to be quite a bit louder and longer than this second sound, S2. So S1 is actually caused by the blood turbulence associated with the closure of the atrioventricular valves. This is right after ventricular systole begins. So this is AV atrioventricular valves closing. So that's where we get this sound from. Right here, you can see that like right here at the beginning of ventricular systole is when we're going to get that sound there. Now the second sound, S2, this is quite a bit shorter, as you can see, than S1, and it's caused by blood turbulence that's associated with the closure of the semilunar valves. And this is right at the beginning of ventricular diastole. So here this is by semilunar valves closing, right here at the beginning of ventricular diastole. On this diagram, we see the ventricular volume changes during a cardiac cycle. So here at this number 3, we see that the atrial systole contributes a final 25 or so milliliters of blood to the volume that's already in each ventricle. So already in each ventricle, at the beginning or before atrial systole, we have about 105 milliliters. Then we have atrial systole that occurs, and this adds about 25 milliliters of blood. Now at the end of atrial systole, so right here, this is also the end of ventricular diastole or ventricular relaxation. So each ventricle contains about 130 milliliters of blood at the end of its relaxation period. Now, this final blood volume is called end diastolic volume, also just known as EDV. Then we have ventricular systole occur, where the ventricles are going to contract and pump that blood out. It's going to pump out about 70 milliliters of blood. Well, the left ventricle is going to inject that 70 milliliters of blood into the aorta. And the right ventricle, they're going to pump the same amount of blood, but the right ventricle is going to pump it into the pulmonary trunk. Now, at the end of ventricular systole, we have still about 60 milliliters left in each of these ventricles, and this is called end systolic volume. We also have this term here, stroke volume. Now this is the volume that's ejected from the heart or from the ventricles each beat. So this equals the end diastolic volume, or EDV, minus the end systolic volume. So minus ESV is going to equal the stroke volume. So at rest, the stroke volume is often going to be around 70 milliliters. That's going to be at rest, and it's going to change whether if you're exercising or not. Okay, so this diagram here shows the phases of the cardiac cycle as we see them in the heart. So first we have atrial contraction, or atrial systole, and this causes the blood in the atria to be pumped down into the ventricle. So from the atria, right atria into the right ventricle, and the left atria into the left ventricle. Then, when both the semilunar and atrioventricular valves are closed, we have this period called isovolumetric contraction. So during this time, the cardiac muscle fibers are contracting and exerting forces, but they're not shortening. So they're staying the same length, but they're still kind of exerting forces. Now during the next phase, we have the ventricles are contracting, and they're going to be pushing blood into the systemic and pulmonary circulations. So this is going to be ventricular systole. Then after the semilunar valves close, there's going to be this small interval when ventricular blood volume doesn't change, and this is because all 4 of the valves are closed, and this period is called isovolumetric relaxation. So this is when all the valves are closed and the volume inside the ventricles doesn't actually change. So we're just going to have kind of that end systolic volume left within the ventricles here. So it's going to be about 60 mils of blood left in each of those ventricles. So that's going to be the first half of the relaxation period. Then in the second half of the relaxation period, this is when those atrioventricular valves are going to open and we have ventricular filling occur. And this is when the ventricles are going to completely fill with blood, and then this is when we have the next cycle begin. Again, with atrial contraction, we start kind of here back at the beginning. So here we have that full entire diagram where we have the ECG, the pressure changes, heart sounds, ventricular volume, and cardiac cycle phases. And you can see exactly where they line up with respect to the atrial systole in the initial pink here, and then the ventricular systole in the purple, relaxation period in the blue, and then the start of a new cycle in the next pink as well. So you can kind of see how they all line up and what is happening with the electrical current at the same time that we have pressure changes, at the same time that we have those heartbeats. So you can kind of see what's happening in each part and kind of correspond them to one another. So cardiac output, abbreviated just CO, this is the volume of blood that's pumped out from the left ventricle or right ventricle into the aorta or pulmonary trunk every minute. So cardiac output is going to equal the stroke volume. Remember, that's the milliliters in each beat. That is ejected. And we're going to multiply that by the heart rate, which is the amount of beats per minute. And that will give us the volume, or the milliliters, pumped out every minute. So that's going to be our cardiac output, or the amount of blood output by the heart every minute. Now, a healthy heart will pump out the blood that entered its chambers during a previous diastole. So in other words, if more blood is going to return to the heart during diastole, then more blood is going to be ejected during the following systole. There are 3 factors that regulate stroke volume and that really are going to ensure that the left and right ventricles are going to pump equal volumes of blood. So the first one is called preload. So this is the degree of stretch on the heart before it contracts. So stretch before contraction. So that's preload. We also have contractility. Now this is the forcefulness of contraction of individual ventricular muscle fibers. So contraction force of ventricle fibers. And then lastly, the last factor that regulates stroke volume is called afterload. And this is the pressure that has to be exceeded before ejection of blood from the ventricles can even occur. So this is like the pressure that we have to reach in order to pump blood out. And that's going to be the end of Chapter 20, Part 8.